Subject's physical age, based on physiological profile, between 60 and 72, aging rapidly.
Oh, I'm 34. I'm 34 years old.
Bridge to all decks. Brace yourself for an incoming Enterprise incident with Scott and Steve. I'm Scott Nance.
I'm Steve Morris, and I'm feeling a couple of aches and pains a little bit, and my brain seems a little foggier than usual. I don't know. I just woke up feeling old. I don't know why.
I mean, my back hurt. I need a new prescription of my glasses. You know, I forgot what I had for breakfast this morning. That must mean that we are up to the deadly years in the original series. And it also means that this is a milestone for us, Steve, because we are now past the halfway point in our deep dives of the original series. This is episode number 41 out of 80. And we are joined by a very special guest. Jim Brooks has been a journalist for many, many years, going back in the day for Starlog Magazine and Starburst Magazine, writing about Star Trek and other sci-fi properties as well. And he is also the writer of the story for the Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Rightful Heir, which picks the ball up from Kahless the Unforgettable and runs with it. And he is also one of my closest and dearest friends, and an absolutely the right person you want to have joining us here on Enterprise Incidents. Welcome, Jim Brooks.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Steve.
Well, Steve, what was your first take on the Deadly Years?
I've always really liked this episode, and it's funny. We've had episodes that were thrilling. We've had episodes that were kind of scary, that were disturbing, that were challenging, and some that were really moving. This one is in many ways the most upsetting to me.
Yeah,
like it's just really painful going through this episode, and it's interesting watching it now, because I'm older, also because I've watched family members basically go through this now too, and seen this process, and it hit pretty hard watching it this time.
You know, Jim, I want to ask, we had talked about having you on Enterprise Incidents for a little while, and when I asked the episode that you would really like to join us for, you picked The Deadly Years. So I would love to hear why you chose this episode for your deep dive with us.
Well, like you, Scott, my favorite character is Kirk, and this is definitely a Kirk episode. You get to see Kirk losing the things that are most important to him, the Enterprise, but it also affects his relationship with Spock. He's losing his edge, and it's something. It's also very timely, like Steve was saying. You see now people who are first and second generation Star Trek fans, ones who started with the original series when it was originally broadcast, and then people coming in during syndication. And we're getting to that age, right?
Yeah, we really are.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. And, I have to say too, that when I remember, sort of that first run that I'm part of the syndication generation like Steve is, whereas Jim watched it, as it was happening. And I have such vivid memories of watching these episodes for the first time. And I vividly remember that scene of Scotty walking into sickbay and Kirk going, Scotty. But what I love about this episode is how much this episode has continued to resonate with me over my deadly years as I've gotten older. And like you said, Steve, how relatable it is because of, people who have gone through something similar to this. But I always thought The Deadly Years was an extremely solid second season episode, and that makes it a really great Star Trek episode. This is done, Gene Kuhn was still the showrunner, and it's the first half of the second season when I certainly think Star Trek was firing on all cylinders. And the premise is far-fetched, sure, but it still works. It's very entertaining. It is compelling. It is provocative, and it is number 11 in the photo novel series.
Right.
We got to get Steve a collection of photo novels, but this is definitely an episode that I keep going back to. It's not like top tier, like Sitting on the Edge of Forever, Mirror, Mirror, the Doomsday Machine, but it is still an episode that I've come to watch over and over again, especially in more recent years. So The Deadly Years was directed by Joseph Pevney, one of the directors who directed the most next to Mark Daniels. And it aired on December 8th, 1967, making it the 41st episode to air. So conveniently, because we're going in production order, it is also the 41st episode to film, which it was done over 6.5 days between August 3rd and August 11th, 1967. The total cost for The Deadly Years, $186,230, which puts it slightly over season 2 budget by about $1,230. Fortunately, the score was tracked. They saved money there. And there was only one visual effects shot needed by the Westheimer Company, and that is the landing party beaming down to Gamma Hydra IV in the beginning of the teaser. Now, where the budget went up a little bit, or the cost went up a little bit, was in the makeup department. So, Steve, you and I have always sang the praises of cinematographer Jerry Finnerman, and we are going to do that again here. But one thing we haven't done enough of, one person who needs to have their praises sung absolutely, is makeup artist Fred Phillips, who was joined by 3 additional teams to do all of the makeup for this makeup heavy episode. And I thought he did a super, super duper job. So the episode was written by David P. Harmon, and he wrote his story outline in May of 1967. At the time, the episode was called Hold Back Tomorrow. So Dorothy Fontana took a look at this title and said, wait a minute, we already have a season 2 episode called Return to Tomorrow. So she suggested they change the title, which Harmon did with his revised story outline dated June 5th, where it was now called The Deadly Years. Harmon wrote 2 draft teleplays, the second of which came in on July 3rd. Gene Kuhn did a script polish in mid-July of 1967, and he did a rewrite, his final draft teleplay, on July 27th. So Harmon was 48 when he wrote The Deadly Years. He also wrote a piece of the action, which I cannot wait to dive into that episode. That's going to be a lot of fun. And also the animated series episode, The Eye of the Beholder, which Steve and I are going to jump into the animated series as well here on Enterprise Incidents. He also wrote other TV shows like Studio 57, Gilligan's Island, The Brady Bunch, Mannix, Ironside, and Vegas. And he wrote the films Johnny Concho, Rock All Night, directed by a young Roger Corman, and The Big Beat.
Wow. Wow. Would you like to know some of the things going on in the world when they were making this episode of television?
Absolutely.
Well, as you said, it was shot August 3rd through August 11th. On August 3rd, Lyndon Johnson asked Congress to raise the corporate tax rate by 10%, which is a huge, huge raise in taxes in order to pay for sending more troops to Vietnam.
Wow.
At this point, there is a 500,000 U.S. Army personnel in Vietnam.
67. Yep.
On the 5th, this is right in the middle, as we talked about before, it's right in the middle of China's Cultural Revolution. And the president of China at the time, who's Lao Shuaoqi, I'm probably pronouncing that terribly, and his wife, well, there was one guy who wasn't a big fan of them, and that guy was Mao Zedong. And so they were removed from their positions. They were put on trial. They were publicly kicked, ridiculed. They were tortured, starved. Lao died in prison 2 years later, and his wife lived for 12 more years, but still in prison. This is also when 2 very, very important organizations finally came completely together, and that is the AFL and the NFL have finally joined at this point. And another sports story is the World Boxing Association had to put together an elimination tournament to find a new heavyweight champion because
Muhammad Ali,
had been stripped of his title. And that started then. In Cambridge, Jocelyn Bell, a scientist studying on a radio telescope, became the first person to discover a pulsar. a peculiar radio signal that happened every 1.33 seconds at a very specific frequency. And it was named the 1919 Cambridge Pulsar because that was its coordinates. There was a nonviolent strike in East Jerusalem protesting the Israeli-approved curriculum that was now being taught in all the Palestinian schools. Scientists in China made 2 tests of conventional weapons, but they were conventional weapons, big bombs, that they put radioactive material into. These, fortunately, have never been used against humans, but they have come to be known as dirty bombs.
Oh, wow.
These are the first 2 dirty bombs. On August 7th, the lunar orbiter, which had been launched 6 days earlier in our previous episode, is now taking very clear pictures of the far side of the moon. Deion Sanders was born, speaking of football. And on August 9th, I don't know if you know this person, but when I was in college, one of the best plays I ever worked on was a play called What the Butler Saw by a playwright named Joe Orton.
Oh,
and
Joe Orton. I know Joe Orton.
I think I know why you know Joe Orton.
Why is that, Steve?
Because of the film Prick Up Your Ears by Stephen Frears.
Okay, that's one reason why I know
okay.
Joe Orton.
Why do you know Joe Orton?
Okay, well, here is a fascinating bit of trivia that has nothing to do with Star Trek, but has everything to do
with the Beatles.
Yes, there you go. So I was waiting for Steve to pick up on the Beatles. So the Beatles had done 2 films. They did A Hard Day's Night and they did Help. They owed one more feature film to United Artists. So Joe Orton was hired by Walter Shenson, the producer of the first 2 Beatles movies, to write the 3rd movie. So, now we're in 1967, so they can't play those happy-go-lucky mop tops anymore. They're way past that stage. So Joe Orton wrote a very bizarre, very avant-garde, and very inaccessible film called Up Against It. That would have had no commercial prospects whatsoever for these Beatles. So it never happened. And from what I understand, Joe Orton died a horrible death. He was beaten over the head by a lover, and that was the end of him.
And the lover who then committed suicide, and that happened on August 9th during the filming of this episode. That's why I brought this whole thing up. This is when Joe Orton was murdered. And on August 10th, Australia, and this just shocks me how late this is, Australia finally amended their constitution to allow Aboriginal natives to be counted as part of their population.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And on August 11th, we're doing a podcast, and regardless of how you feel about him, one of the most important podcasters in the world was born, and that is Joe Rogan.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So that is what was going on in the world when they were filming The Deadly Years. Would you like to enter those years now?
Well, I think we're ready. Time. We have to enter The Deadly Years because time is running out.
That's exactly right. So we beam down to the planet, and they expected to be greeted by people, and there is nobody there.
Where is everyone?
I love the way the episode just starts right with the beam down. You don't see the Enterprise orbiting Gamma Hydra IV. The beam down happens, and you hear that music cue of the transporter that was used for the Doomsday machine. The camera zooms in a little, and I like how you're there. This is established that something is already very wrong just by the howling wind and the planet sounds.
I had a subspace contact with a Robert Johnson, the leader of this expedition, an hour ago.
Well, did he report anything wrong?
No, yet there was something wrong. I can't quite pin it down. His conversation was disjointed. His thoughts, a little foggy, unrelated.
So Kirk tells Chekov and the rest of the landing party to look around.
And this shot is remarkable because Chekov goes into a building, and I think this is right out of a John Ford movie. It is black completely everywhere except for the bright light coming through the door, which Chekov is coming in through. It looks amazing. It is very creepy. It is very scary. And then lights suddenly flash on, and there is a body.
Let's say hello to Alvin.
Chekov freaks out, runs out, calling for the captain. He is very, very scared.
Right.
Well, what I like about the scene is like the way, Steve, you pointed out, he's walking into this room, it's completely black. And the way the light comes on and you see Chekov look up and then look down, and then he sees the dead body. You know what I mean? Like, you see him reacting to the light coming on before you see what he's actually looking at. And when he runs out of the building, and he's freaking out, he's crying out for the captain, the way Kirk grabs him. One thing that I always liked about the beginning of the second season was how Chekov is a new character. He was just introduced, and he was already given like a dynamic because of the way he like did in-jokes about Russia. But he was 22, so he was young, and he was really like looks at Kirk as a father figure. And I like that there was a paternal relationship between Kirk and Chekov.
Well, it's kind of interesting, first of all, that Chekov is so scared. That always hit me. How many missions has he been on? But, you have to have that so that you can get into adrenaline and such later.
Command, sir! In there! A dead man!
Kirk just like looks past Chekov, and then they all walk into the building, and then the light comes on again, and they're all seeing the dead body. And this is just one of the reasons that I really felt like season 2 just fell into this great rhythm, was like you see the reaction, like Kirk's reaction, he's a little startled. Spock's reaction is interesting. He's shaking his head up and down, like fascinating. Like you know what he's thinking.
Exactly what it looks like. Death by natural causes, old age.
Jim, what's your take on the way this scene is playing out so far?
It's a striking scene, especially because of what happens next when Robert Johnson comes in with his wife.
Well, and this is the thing, because what we find out is there is nobody old on this planet. That Spock just went through all the personnel. This is not possible. And then just, Jim, as you said, in wander Robert Johnson and his wife, Elaine. And these people do definitely not look like young people.
Okay, so Robert Johnson is played by Felix Locker, and Elaine Johnson is played by Laura Wood. So here's the interesting thing. So I thought I knew so much, or certainly everything there was to know about Star Trek, the original series. So in doing this research, I realized Laura Wood looked kind of familiar, and then I found out why. Jim, do you know why Laura Wood looks familiar?
No.
Okay, well, here it is. Remember the scene in Charlie X when Charlie turns a young female crew member into oh yeah. He turns her into an older woman, and she's feeling her face, and she screams like she's horrified. That is Laura Wood. So this is actually her second appearance in Star Trek.
Second appearance as a young person that has been turned into an old person.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm telling you, mind blown.
That's her niche.
I'm Captain Kirk of...
You'll have to speak louder.
I say I'm Captain Kirk of the USS Enterprise. Who are you?
I'm Robert Johnson.
And then Kirk asks, how old are you?
And Robert Johnson, he goes, let me see. Like they're prolonging the intensity.
Let me see. I am 29. And Elaine is
I'm 27.
The zoom in to Kirk's expression, his reaction is great. And Jim, I always like this teaser. Again, it's not like an episode that's mentioned ever in like the greatest Star Trek episodes of all time. But I love this teaser. I love this setup. How about you?
Well, it's perfectly what you want. I mean, a teaser is supposed to grab you, thus the name teaser, and I like that better than the current cold open. It grabs you. It's absolutely counterintuitive that people who are 29 and 27 are going to look like they're in their 80s. And then, of course, you do what you always do in Star Trek. You push in on Shatner, and then you cut. It's a great teaser.
First of all, I couldn't agree more about the phrase cold open. I think it is the least descriptive, most confusing, stupid phrase. And the fact that that's become what people call things just seems silly. I think the teaser totally works, but I also think it doesn't quite make sense because, first of all, Kirk says, I just talked to Robert Johnson an hour ago. That's not a lot of time for him to be this old. And second of all, they're so happy. You know, it's like they're going through exactly what our crew has gone through, and the fact they're like, "Hey, how you doing?" I think it doesn't really make a lot of sense,
Well,
but it totally works.
Here's why it does make sense. So when Kirk said that he spoke to Robert Johnson not a half an hour ago, he told Spock that something was off. He was foggy. His conversation was disjointed. So he probably didn't age a whole lot in that half hour or an hour, but you know, he had no idea that, I mean, none of us knew what we were expecting. I mean, it wasn't like he said, "Oh yeah, everything sounded great." Like Kirk was already suspicious that something was wrong by what was in his voice. So Johnson was already quite old by that point. And the other thing is, what was your other thing that you just said?
Their just performances are so happy.
But here's the other thing. They're so past where the landing party is by the end of the Deadly Years, by the end of this episode, before the serum kicks in, that they're delusional and they've got dementia and they're out of it.
Well, and also I think that, you see later on in sickbay, the only thing that's on Robert Johnson's mind is his wife.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe he's happy that they're still together in their golden years, which is in their 20s, right?
There you go. And let's go to sickbay. So we come back in Act 1. We're in sickbay. Robert Johnson is on the bed, and we're trying to communicate with him, and he can hear, but he doesn't really understand what's going on. And we head to the briefing room, and there we meet Commodore Stockard.
Commodore Stocker, a very, very familiar face in the late 1960s, because he is played by Charles Drake, who had an incredibly storied and prolific career on the small screen and in the big screen on classics like Harvey, Winchester 73, both with Jimmy Stewart, Glenn Miller story, same. All That Heaven Allows, directed by Douglas Sirk. Valley of the Dolls, one of the great camp classics. Also on TV with Wagon Train, Mission Impossible, Macmillan and Wife. Interestingly, Stocker's original name was Cook. And Dorothy Fontana flagged it and said, I think we might have a problem here with Cook being Captain Cook, and there was like some kind of licensing deal thing that they had to be careful of. So the name was changed to Stocker. Now, Stocker is a character that we've kind of seen before on Star Trek, haven't we, fellas?
Well, everybody but Kirk is incompetent. Commodores are all, they're washouts, and he's another one.
I think he's the variation on a theme, because he's not a jerk. Like we've had these ones that are aggressive before and really stupid and really jerks. This guy's nice. He really is trying really hard to be respectful and do the right thing. And he's being included here in this briefing because apparently this is his area. The starbase that he's covers this planet. And we also meet another doctor, Dr. Wallace.
Dr. Wallace, played by Sarah Marshall. Also, some very interesting films like The Long Hot Summer, Wild and Wonderful, and even more recently, being, in the last 30 years, the film Dave with Kevin Kline and Sigourney Weaver. Yeah. On TV, she was in Thriller, The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Get Smart, I Spy, Three's Company, and The Jeffersons. So say hello to Dr. Janet Wallace.
And we review kind of what's going on and basically find out that we have no idea what's going on.
My examinations have turned up absolutely nothing. In fact, I don't have a clue.
And we talk about maybe something in the atmosphere, and then this plant is very important.
We're close to the neutral zone between our Federation and the Romulan Empire. It's possible that Romulans have a new weapon and are using this colony as guinea pigs.
Spock has already started looking into that area. And you know what? When I was rewatching this episode, guys, it was at this moment when Kirk says the Romulans and the neutral zone. And again, this is an episode that I've seen nonstop over these years, these last, for me, 50 years, even though it's been 55 years. Uh, First of all, listening to it on my tape recorder when I taped it off of a TV. Then, of course, taping it on my VCR, buying the VHS, buying the DVDs, buying the Blu-rays, watching it on all the streaming services. And it wasn't until this moment, watching it again for our discussion, that it occurred to me how much the Deadly Years really does establish a continuity.
Yeah.
I mean, like, really, one of the top 3 or 4 episodes of the original series that really leaned into what had been established so far. And this is just the beginning.
I totally agree. And just at the end of the scene, Commodore Stalker very nicely says, hey, I'm kind of anxious to get to Starbase 10 to get my new post.
Yes, Commodore, we'll do everything we can to make sure you make your due date.
Thank you, sir.
You're right, Steve. I was thinking about this when I was watching the episode. I was ready to lean into him and be like, oh, he's just like Ambassador Fox from A Taste of Armageddon, or he's just like Commissioner Ferris from the Galileo 7, just a really annoying, grating superior that Kirk has to answer to on the Enterprise, and Kirk just does not want him there. But Stalker, you're right. He's like, I really believe that he means well throughout the course of this episode. And that does make him different from the other Commodores, but that does not mean that Kirk likes him anymore.
One thing that I definitely think they get wrong is he shouldn't be a Commodore. Is a Commodore outranks a captain. And he says, thank you, sir, to Kirk. It's like they should have made him a commissioner. They should have made him some other thing.
True.
Because it's weird to me that he's a Commodore. But he heads out, and now we're alone with this strange doctor who's still standing around. And immediately that romantic music comes in, and we go, oh, okay.
Is there something I can do for you?
Okay, so first of all, the music that you're hearing was just recorded for Mirror Mirror because it was Marlena Moreau's theme, and it fits perfectly with Dr. Janet Wallace here in The Deadly Years. So here's the other. Okay, so get ready for this, fellas. This is another moment where it occurred to me that there's continuity as being established right here in this simple scene of flirting, of reminiscing between Kirk and Wallace, and here's why. So first of all, Kirk says,
how long has it been?
6 years, 4 months, and an odd number of days. You mean you don't know?
Doesn't that delivery sound familiar to both of you?
I literally wrote down the other line that it is identical, almost identical to.
And what is that line, Steve Morris?
How long has it been?
4 years, 7 months, and an odd number of days.
Which is how long it's been since Kirk had seen, I don't remember her name, but the prosecuting attorney and court martial.
Ariel Shaw.
Ariel Shaw, yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. I thought, wouldn't that have been like a great sort of running joke, how whenever Kirk, like let's say Star Trek had lasted, beyond 3 years, and, he runs into another old flame and he says, how long's it been? And she says, 8 years, 6 months, and an odd number of days. But the interesting thing is that both of these episodes, The Deadly Years and Court Martial, feature Captain Kirk on trial.
Good point. And in a very vulnerable position.
But the line that she says about the last time she saw Jim Kirk was 6 years, 4 months, and an odd number of days. So 6 years ago, where does that put Kirk in his timeline? Is he still at the academy? Is he serving as a lieutenant on the Starship Farragut? I'm just like trying to sort of like place in my head like where he was and where that relationship could have been. Probably at the academy, because if Kirk was already, out there on the Farragut, he was not emotionally available for a romantic relationship.
It's interesting that you bring this up because we have reached the episode where we find out how old Kirk is, which we have referenced over and over and over again in this podcast. And I think that his age in this episode is a mistake. I think he should have been older. I think he should have been 38 or 39, not 34, because if he's, his advancement is just way too fast.
Well, it's a lot slower than it was in the 2009 Star Trek movie.
That is a fair point.
Yeah.
It's what's interesting to me is that Kirk's behavior around Ariel Shaw is very flirtatious and romantic, and it's obvious that they have a light kind of relationship. She might be more into him than he is into her, but they're having fun.
Yeah.
Whereas the energy in this scene is very different. Kirk is very guarded. In fact, she says,
Be a little less the cool, efficient captain and a little more the old friend.
Okay, so here's my question for you, Jim Brooks. So, what color is Janet Wallace's hair?
I knew you were going to ask this.
Blonde, of course.
Okay, so my question for you, Jim, is Janet Wallace the blonde lab technician that Gary Mitchell is alluding to in Where No Man Has Gone Before?
I was wondering if you were going to say that. It could be. It could be. And, what Steve was saying, just going off of that, the fact that this is very different from the Shaw relationship, this is definitely something that is important to Kirk. And that plugs in with what you're saying about possibly being, the woman that Gary Mitchell's talking about in the second pilot. But it's definitely a different relationship. There's history. Like you said, it's very serious. And an earlier version of the script, Kirk is a little more bitter as far as the breakup.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah. And some of it is dialogue that makes it into the script. But as I was watching the episode again and reading through the script, it's amazing when you have those two sources there. You look at what Shatner does with those lines, which come off as sharper and maybe not as positive for Kirk, but the way Shatner delivers them, he's taken the edge off of them and he's infused them with a little bit of lightness, and he comes off much more positive. And, even though it was a bad ending, obviously.
Yeah. And by the way, that is why William Shatner was born to play this guy.
It's true.
But, as far as like Gary Mitchell's reference to the blonde lab technician, I mean, I think in terms of like fan retcon, it's been sort of more universally accepted and sort of leaned into that Carol Marcus from The Wrath of Khan was the blonde lab technician. Now, interestingly, in very early drafts for The Wrath of Khan, Janet Wallace was the scientist from Kirk's past.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in that
Didn't know
movie.
that.
Wow.
So it was changed to Carol Marcus, but whether or not Sarah Marshall could have played her in 1982, and she was definitely still around, she could have, but that would have been really interesting to have that continuity brought from second season episode Deadly Years to the greatest Trek movie of them all in The Wrath of Khan. But regardless, it is still fun to speculate who exactly that blonde lab technician was that Gary Mitchell was alluding to.
Well, that's as close to canon as you can get, I guess, without it actually appearing on screen.
Yeah.
It's an odd relationship. I find it, and the more I'm thinking about why they chose to put this kind of a relationship into the show, the more I think it's brilliant. Because one of the things I see in this scene is that Kirk does not like to appear vulnerable. Is that I think, because I'm thinking about, okay, what happened? Well, she got assigned probably fairly recently to the Enterprise, and because she says this thing about being less the cool, efficient captain. I don't think he has given her any kind of personal time with him until this moment. And I think he's done that because he actually is vulnerable, and he's being sort of, and that he kind of warms up to her a little bit. And he says,
things wouldn't change if it started all over again, would it? You have your job, I have my ship, and neither one of us will change.
I think there's some real pain in there.
There definitely is. And, you mentioned Kirk being vulnerable. And you know what, Steve, I never thought about that, about how, who knows how long Wallace had been on the ship by this point, but this is probably the first time that he is letting down his guard and being, more laid back, more intimate with her. And he is being vulnerable, and he's about to get a whole lot more vulnerable in ways that Wallace will become more attracted to.
Well, and I think also, continuing on with that point, having somebody that he had a relationship so close years ago that that ended prematurely, shall we say, it really underscores that vulnerability that you're talking about, because it's one thing to be off your game, to be losing your faculties in front of somebody that you haven't known very long, but somebody who's known you for so long and so intimately, it makes that feeling of incipient loss even worse.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a great point. It's a great point. And I think when they broke up, I think Kirk cut it all off completely.
In all those years, I only heard from you once. A starcry when my husband died. You know, you never asked me why I got married after we called it off.
This is where good writing can tell you a whole bunch of things about a backstory with very, very few lines.
Well, I suppose that you met someone you loved.
I met a man I admired, a great man.
Big difference. Big difference.
Huge difference.
And in the same field as you didn't have to give up a thing.
No. Just you.
And the music is romantic, and he's moving closer, and we know they're about to have that kiss that they haven't had in 6 years, 4 months, and an odd number of days. And right at that moment,
Captain Kirk.
Saved by the bell.
Yeah, there's the hail from the bridge. And that Spock wants to see him, so we head up to the bridge.
Standard orbit, Captain. Maintain.
Yeah, remember that.
Yep. And Kirk asks about this comet. Apparently a comet went by recently.
We're running checks on it. I've reached no conclusions as yet. The comet was a rogue and has never been investigated.
One of the images that I've always loved in Star Trek over these decades is the image of Spock at his science station and Kirk standing next to them, and the two of them talking through a situation. Their chemistry is so great, and by this point in the early second season, they've established such a rhythm. And I think it's just so taken for granted now. It's just in the annals of television and film, just when two people really have to have the right chemistry. But Shatner and Nimoy, they just absolutely had it. I love watching the two of them work through stuff like this together.
And there's Commodore Stockard going, hey, dude, you know, Starbase 10 is a really cool place.
This is interesting. I'm only really thinking about this for the first time, that even though he certainly means well and his demeanor and his delivery is a lot more, I would say, accessible than that of Ferris and Fox, he's still anxious to assume a position of power. So this is what I love about this scene. Starbase 10 has great facilities to meet the needs for them to figure out what happened to the colonists on Gamma Hydra IV. And Kirk shuts him down in a way where he is beaming with pride about the Enterprise.
I know you're anxious to get to the base, but we have a few facilities of our own here. I think the Enterprise will do quite nicely. I'll be in engineering, Mr. Spock.
And then Kirk heads out, and just as he's heading out,
maintain standard orbit, Mr. Sulu.
You already gave that command, sir.
Oh? Well, follow it.
And he exits. Sulu looks over at Spock, and the camera pushes in on Spock.
And I think in this specific scene, the thing that has the most power, if you're looking for it, is like you were saying. We move over and we look at Spock, and Spock is plainly concerned. He sees that something is wrong. And if you watch the episode, as you go through the episode, when you get into, I think it's Act 3, where we have the competency hearing, and then in the end at Act 4, a lot of what they do is not only do you see the degeneration from the performance from Shatner, but they're very good at showing you the reaction of the junior officers and his fellow officers when he starts down that slope. It's a very effective way of underscoring and amplifying that.
And I think that comes from director Joseph Pevney, because by this point he had already directed quite a few episodes of Star Trek, and that's also Gene Kuhn running the show, being the day-to-day producer on it. Again, this is Star Trek is really it's in its comfort zone, it's in its rhythm. Everything is just working, firing on all cylinders.
The other thing, I know I brought this up before, is this idea that the audience can be with the characters in the show, they can be behind them, or they can be ahead of them, meaning we know what they know, we know less than they know, we know more than we know. This episode is structured like a horror movie, and we are ahead of the characters. Because
I never thought of that.
Because the moment that Kirk repeats the order, and probably even before, because we know we're watching a show, oh no, they're all going to get old. We know it before anybody. And by the time we have that push in on Spock, we know it 100% what is about to happen. And the feeling of dread that you get is pretty palpable.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think also that by this point in their relationship, Spock knows Kirk better than anyone. And anyone else might have just laughed it off when Kirk repeated the order and just, defensively said, "Oh, well, follow it." But Spock knows already something very minor, but Spock knows that something is wrong.
And now we're about to get it confirmed because we go into sickbay and in comes Lieutenant Galloway, who is the other person who I didn't mention who was down in that landing party. And she comes in to talk to Dr. McCoy.
Doctor, may I speak to you for a moment, please?
So Lieutenant Galloway is played by Beverly Washburn, who is a child actor, and she was on film, serialized film, in Superman and the Mole Men. She was also in the classic film Shane, the classic film version of The Lone Ranger, and one of the all-time great films from our youth, everybody's youth, Old Yeller. She was also on TV in Fireside Theater, The Loretta Young Show, the new Loretta Young Show, Wagon Train, Gidget, The Streets of San Francisco.
That's crazy that she's in Shane because we literally just did Shane for the Cinephiles. And so she must be one of the daughters of the homesteaders.
That's exactly who she is.
Well, I know this is going to sound foolish, but, well, I seem to be having a little trouble hearing.
Well, it's probably nothing important.
Do you notice anything about Dr. McCoy at this moment?
I do. Jim, do you?
Yeah, he's already starting to get gray.
Yeah.
He's already starting to get gray. Very, very subtly. We'll see a little bit more of that gray coming up in just a couple of moments. But when I see the scene, every time I see the scene, Jim Brooks, what do you think I think of every time I see the scene of Lieutenant Galway wanting to talk to Dr. McCoy?
A blooper shot?
Yes, exactly.
I feel like hell, I forgot my line.
Yes. Beverly Washburn was filming her scene. She forgot a line. She goes, "I feel like hell, I forgot my line."
Well, this episode has a couple of good bloopers.
Oh, yeah. We'll get to the others.
And now we get to go to Kirk's quarters and see William Shatner with the shirt off. I'm sure he was thrilled about this. And he calls up to the bridge for a progress report. That's all perfectly normal. And then he says,
Astronomical section reports that a comet recently passed by. Check into that.
I'm doing that, Captain, as per your previous order.
I always found this episode really painful to watch. And now having, my dad died of ALS, and so which is a terrible degenerative disease. And having watched someone I loved slowly lose the ability to be the person they wanted to be, watching it this time was rougher,
Yeah. This episode, I definitely have in more recent years been more in tune with what afflicts all of the landing party members, but particularly Kirk when it comes to losing his memory, especially his short-term memory, like he does in this episode. Very relatable. Never thought about it when I was 6 years old, 16 or 26, but 53, you start thinking about stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, my mother-in-law has dementia right now, and so has no short-term memory, and it's weird to watch this.
Yes.
And Kirk has a reaction to the fact that he repeated this thing, but kind of moves over it and says he's going to head to sickbay, and then as he's grabbing his shirt, he gets a twinge of pain
in his lower back.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Yeah. We arrive at sickbay. Robert Johnson has died. Well,
hang on. Wait a minute, Steve.
Okay.
Robert Johnson has died. McCoy does nothing. But in this case, wait a minute. In this case, he's allowed. It's old age, natural causes. Well, McCoy is off the hook.
He tried. It's not like he hasn't been trying. And then Kirk, grabs his arm, and we could see that he's in pain. And just at this moment, we hear a message from Scotty.
Dr. McCoy, this is Scott. May I come up and see you?
All you need are vitamins, but you can come up anyhow.
And of course, we know, this is what I mean about us being ahead. We know, something's going on with Scotty. And then Kirk says, this is all happening very fast.
Holmes, I believe you're getting gray.
You take over my job and see what happens to you.
It's a moment of levity. At least Kirk thinks it's a moment of levity. But in addition to the fact that Bones is now a little grayer than he was just a few moments ago with Lieutenant Galway, he's also becoming more irascible.
Yep, absolutely. 100%. And his bedside manner at this moment, he says,
"What's your problem, Jim?"
What's your problem, Jim? Yeah, that's what he says to his captain.
and Kirk, playing things down. It's a shoulder twinge, probably muscular strain. And I love this little bit.
Probably right, Doctor. By the way, I don't like the way you've been running this ship lately.
And Kirk knows what that. He's like, all right, reprimand received. I get it.
Yeah.
And again, this all played perfectly. He goes to examine the arm. He thinks it's not going to be anything. Then looks at what's that little device called, by the way?
Jim?
Well, they called them Feinbergers, but it's a medical scanner.
It's a medical scanner. Why'd they call them Feinbergers?
That was the property master.
Oh, nice.
Feinberg.
And he looks at it again, examines again, looks at it again. And then this moment, I don't know if this was in the script or if this was the director, but they play it absolutely perfectly. And Shatner's reaction is great. Bones goes and touches his hand, and Shatner jumps like a reflex. You could feel that shot of pain.
Yeah, he goes, ow.
Yeah.
He like McCoy grabs his hand, grabs his joint, squeezes his joint, and Kirk's reflex, he pulls it back, and it's just like, ow. And you're right. It's perfectly played because a moment of levity quickly changes to a moment of dread and high drama. And Jim, I mean, I got to say that's starting with this scene with McCoy. I think that D. Kelly is superb in this episode.
Well, yeah. Let me say this. This is Kirk's episode. This is Shatner's episode. But the work that D. Kelly does in this, because we're all used to watching D. Kelly play D. Kelly, right?
Yeah, sure.
You watch what he does, and we've all had older relatives. He's spot on, and I don't understand. I know there was talk around the set about him being pushed for an Emmy nomination.
Correct.
I don't know why he didn't get one, because he just, as far as performance goes, he blows everybody else away.
I agree with that.
Jim, I think we'd better run a complete physical on you.
Why? Just muscular strain, isn't it?
It's advanced arthritis. It's spreading.
It's impossible.
And again, this is why this is so well constructed. It's just as we're dealing with that, and McCoy says, I can run it through again, but I'll come up with the same thing. And just as we're in this emotion, in walks Scotty.
Scotty.
What a shocking moment. Jim, do you remember the first time you saw this episode and you saw Scotty walk through the door into sickbay looking old? Because I do.
Yeah. It's an episode that, it leaves an indelible impression. And that's a great way to hook into the next act.
I want to say, Steve, you were, the way you were just describing The Deadly Years as a horror story makes so much sense when I think back to my youth, watching these episodes for the first time. And remember, Steve, when we were talking about Mirror, Mirror, I said that, Spock kind of scared me in that episode. Well, so I'm watching these episodes in production order when I'm a kid. So the next episode that I watched, the following week was, The Deadly Years. So when Scotty walked in, and I knew who Scotty was because I just seen Mirror, Mirror. When Scotty walked in looking old, I remember being scared.
This one scared me. I wasn't scared by bearded Spock. I was scared by this episode. And we come back in Act 2, and there is Chekov in sickbay getting examined, having to do that leg kicky exercise thing, because he is the one person who was not affected by this. And I love, by the way, they set up the moment that Kirk turns towards camera and we see how he's changed.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And Shatner has, I forget where he wrote this, whether it's Star Trek Memories or Star Trek Movie Memories, but the type of setup he loved to do in a scene was where he had his back to the camera and would turn around quickly. And he did that in the teaser for The Enemy Within. Remember when he steps off the platform, and he did it towards the end of Act 1 when he turns to the camera and says, "Me, my human said that. I've been resting here ever since you left me." And he does it here. And he's great at it. No wonder he loves it.
He does it in a mock time too.
We're in a mock time.
Remember, he goes, "Why must he die?"
Oh, right. Why within 8 days? Yeah. You're right.
It's good memory. It's so funny that the things that pop out at you, and it's really fun because that is such a theatrical move. Yeah. Everyone in podcast land got to see me make that move. And what we hear is that everyone, with the exception of Chekov, are aging at approximately 30 years a day.
Wow. At that rate, they're in very serious trouble. And Spock estimates they have a week left to live, but that they would become mental vegetables in less time than that.
Total senility.
Yes, Captain. In a very short time.
See, what's interesting here is now that you're starting to show everyone being affected by the ravages of the comet, this is where Fred Phillips had to step up the teams that he had working with him. That this is where he had 3 additional makeup teams working with him. So McCoy's performance is more showy, and it's great. And Shatner's performance is more showy, and it's also great. But Leonard Nimoy's performance in this episode, and Steve, you and I have talked about so many great episodes where Nimoy was just magnificent, like obviously A Mock Time, Mirror, Mirror, This Side of Paradise. But Spock's gradual descent is just that. It's more gradual. It's more subtle. It's more, I would say, dialed back. But it's just as effective because it's Spock that this is happening to. He's still trying to hold on, but he starts talking a little slower, his voice is a little deeper, but he still is Spock.
Well, and we have this moment where McCoy turns to Spock and says,
"Oh, you're perfectly healthy."
And Spock's reply is so, I think this is among the most vulnerable, maybe since A Mock Time, that we've seen him.
I must differ with you, Doctor. I'm having difficulty concentrating, which is most disturbing. My eyesight appears to be failing, and the normal temperature of the ship seems to me to be increasingly cold.
And McCoy's response is,
"I did not say you weren't affected, Mr. Spock. You are perfectly healthy. That is, for any normal Vulcan on the high side of 100.
And that's when it hit me, watching it again, that another establishment of continuity with McCoy. While he's getting older, his Southern dialect is getting thicker, and he's leaning into his old country doctor mannerisms like he did in This Side of Paradise. Was that something that stuck out to you too, Jim?
Oh, yeah. I mean, considering too that I have a lot of relatives from the South, and it's more and more like they do. He slides into it perfectly. He times it well. He doesn't go too fast into that sliding back to childhood or to his young adulthood. You kind of see that too in This Side of Paradise when he's affected by the spores. He goes full out Southern, you know.
Yep, absolutely. Well, one of the interesting things I think is that we get to see basically what kind of old men these guys are going to be. And the next one we see is Scotty, who says,
"Captain, would I go back to the station?"
You feel up to it, Scotty?
Of course I do. I just need a wee bit of rest, that's all.
Poor Jimmy.
and Spock kind of helps him out, and I go, okay, so McCoy is the irascible, grumpy old doctor. Spock is becoming increasingly frail and slow-speaking and vulnerable, and Kirk has all this energy, which we're going to see, and all of this desire to do stuff, and Scotty's like grandpa that's going to fall asleep on the couch. You know?
Yeah. Well, you know, for considering that Jimmy Doohan didn't, other than obviously going through the makeup process and having just that shocking moment at the end of the first act where he walks into sickbay, Jimmy didn't really have as much to
Right.
do as he did in some of these more recent episodes, and that was something that he was disappointed by. But still, the moments that he had really, really counted. And a couple interesting things is that so McCoy is getting older, and the makeup process that was used on DeForest Kelley, when it came time to film DeForest Kelley's cameo in Star Trek The Next Generation for the premiere episode, Encounter at Farpoint, the makeup team on Next Gen actually referred to the makeup that was used on DeForest Kelley for the deadly years. And it was really, really smart. And the other thing, so we talk about makeup and how Fred Phillips just really, really, like, this was his baby, this episode. So Jim, I'm sure you know, in the book, The Making of Star Trek, what are the photos that we see in that book?
Yeah, so we see the photo of Shatner having his hair pulled back and silvered, which are also in the Cushman book too. What I thought was funny was that Shatner's hair thins when he gets to that point. And then, of course, later on, it thickens again. And I've often wondered if maybe his hair getting thicker and not following logically had something to do with Mr. Shatner himself.
Possibly, yeah.
It certainly wouldn't surprise me.
But one other thing that this scene established is that Vulcans age a lot
great
more
point.
slowly.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that Vulcans, they age a lot more slowly than humans, which is why when we got to Sarek and Spock's appearances in The Next Generation, they were able to be played by Mark Leonard and Leonard Nimoy, respectively, without wearing any makeup, by the way.
And then this next moment is this is where you really see a director, because, and I'll say it real quick, but there's a basic way you shoot a scene, which is you shoot a master, which is where you see everybody. And then you take your camera and you shoot the individual close-ups or two shots that you need. And then when someone talks, the basic normal way of making a film is you cut to their close-up. And that is exactly what Joseph Pevney is going to choose not to do. Because we hear McCoy say, "You can leave, Lieutenant Galway," but we do not see her.
What? You spoke to me, Doctor.
And they suggest she goes to her quarters and gets some sleep.
No, I don't want to sleep. Can't you understand? If I sleep, what will I find when I wake up?
And again, we're not cutting to her. And what that's doing is it's withholding her face because we're ahead, we're going, oh no, how old is she going to look?
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking scene. And it's also a terrifying scene because of what we talked about before, about how when you hear something before you see it. And this is a great use of that.
Yeah. And finally, as she gets up, we see her. And first thing we see is she walks towards a mirror.
That's a stupid place to hang a mirror.
And you know what? I got to say, she's right. That is a stupid place to hang a mirror.
Well, and it wasn't there when Colin was going with Marla MacGyver's. It wasn't there. We walk by that door a lot.
Yep.
And again, we go back to Chekov. That's the big question. Why is Chekov not aging? And Kirk says,
is it his youth, his blood type, his heritage, his glands, his genes?
And what unfortunately this means, Chekov gets to have another complete physical. And we hear as he's jumping on the bed in a very youthful manner.
It won't hurt much. Promises.
Yeah, by the way, helping him get on the bed there is Nurse Christine Chappell, of course, played by Majel Barrett. But it's interesting to point out Majel Barrett here for two reasons. One, because she does double duty in this episode, also as the voice of the computer of the Enterprise. And also because, unlike with the previous episode, Mirror Mirror, where you had the entire, the top 7 cast members of Star Trek, all with great roles, now you have 8 of them, the big 8, so to speak, if you include Nurse Chapel, Majel Barrett. And that's another thing that's really great about this episode is they're all there.
Kirk is outside in the corridor, and who is waiting for him but Dr. Wallace?
Look, we know the problem. We know the progress of the affliction. Therefore, once we find the proper line of research, it's only logical we find a solution.
And I love that Kirk goes, "You sound like my first officer."
Yeah.
But then this is where this scene gets weird.
No problem is insoluble, not even ours.
Now, is the hours could refer to the disease that we're facing. That is our problem. But I don't think that's what she's saying.
No, I don't think that's what she's saying either. I think she's referring to their relationship in general.
Yeah.
Our situation doesn't have its roots in logic. The heart is not a logical organ.
This is where Kirk points out or asks her, how much older was your husband? And she says that he was 26 years older. And obviously that, Kirk even responds, that's quite a difference. But what's motivating Wallace here by this point? Is it just to rekindle the romance with Kirk, or is she becoming more attracted to him because she has an affinity for older men, and Kirk is now an older man?
You could see it either way. And certainly I think that she's afraid he's seeing it that way. But I wonder too if maybe she's kind of trying to bring herself back into his life. He's in a position where he wasn't before, where maybe he needs her a little more than he did before. So she can kind of swoop in as like a white knight in a way.
Oh, that's a good point.
I don't think it's manipulative. I think that maybe she sees this as an opportunity.
I completely agree with that, Jim. But it's the other side of this conversation that is the really interesting one. To me, why does Kirk ask this question? Because it's what's going on with Kirk. And here's the big thought that I had is I think Kirk is really insecure. Is that I think he was far more heartbroken than he ever wanted to admit when she married this other guy. I think he is, and now that she is paying more attention to him, he's literally going to the most surface and most insubstantial reason of why she might be attracted to him. Oh, is it just because I'm older now? Mm-hmm. And what this makes me think, because Kirk never shows vulnerability. He's Captain Kirk. You know what I mean? And we've always believed that he's just the most confident guy you could possibly imagine. And in this moment, I think not only are we seeing that this aging Kirk is far more vulnerable and insecure, I think it's revealing that he always has been. He's just had the skill and confidence to put that aside and do what is necessary to do,
Well, when we did see Kirk vulnerable, it was at another point early in the voyages of the USS Enterprise. Mm-hmm. And it was also when Kirk was at the mercy of an affliction.
Exactly.
What am I talking about, Steve?
Naked time.
Right. No beach to walk on.
Yeah.
Never lose you.
Well, and that is also a case where he put aside love, and I think this is that there's real deep pain here. And I think that pain is bubbling to the surface. And this is such a strong, difficult, painful moment is he says, look at me. What do you see?
I see Captain James Kirk, a man of morality, decency, handsome and strong.
And old.
The way Shatner says, he goes, and old. Shatner is great in this episode. I mean, he's right on point.
And I think that's also a very important line in that you see that Kirk at this point, even amongst his vulnerability, he's got a more realistic attitude about where he is. If you look later in the story, which we'll get to, obviously, suddenly he's not, he needs the kind of affirmation and attention that she's trying to give him now. At this point, he at least is realistic enough to say, what are you offering me, Jan? Love or going away present?
Ouch. Yep.
That is such a painful line.
Yeah.
That is real. And I think it's because I think he did love her a lot. And now he's basically saying, I don't want your pity.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what he's saying.
We're up on the bridge. This is among my favorite Chekov moments of all of Star Trek. Yeah. I think it's so great. He says,
some more blood, Chekov. A needle wouldn't hurt, Chekov. Take off your shirt, Chekov. Roll over, Chekov. Breathe deeply, Chekov. Blood sample, Chekov. Marrow sample, Chekov. Skin sample, Chekov. If I live long enough, I'm going to run out of samples.
And Sulu's just at his, he's minding his own business, doing his job, and he looks over to Chekov and just kind of smirks. He goes, "You'll live."
Yes, but I won't enjoy it. I think that's perfect. It's a perfect Sulu Chekov moment. It's great.
But that levity is not a sign of things to come for this upcoming scene on the bridge, which is hard to watch. It is painful to watch the humiliation that our hero goes through in this next scene.
Maintaining standard orbit, Captain.
Reach orbit to 20,000 perigee, Mr. Sulu.
And a yeoman comes to bring him something to sign, and he drops his pen, and she goes to pick it up, and he goes, "Yeoman?"
Yeah, he stops her like, "Don't pick up the pen. I could do it," basically. So this is Yeoman Atkins, played by Carolyn Nelson. I bring her up for two reasons. One, because she would soon be married to Joseph Sargent, and Joseph Sargent directed the Corbomite maneuver and gave Leonard Nimoy rather, probably the most useful criticism and direction when it came to playing Spock with his delivery of the word fascinating. But also this moment where you have this yeoman of the week, they're still sort of bringing yeoman in week after week, who really made me miss Yeoman Rand.
I agree. Well, and it would have been interesting, like if it was, instead of Dr. Wallace, if it was Yeoman Rand.
Oh yeah, well that's true too. Oh, that would have been really interesting. Sure.
This moment though of Kirk trying to pick up the pen, and Jim, as you brought this up before, it's the reaction shots that make it so painful, because you see everybody watching him. And I'm telling you, and I'm not going to go into it in too much, but the first thing that my dad lost was the use of his hands. That's what they became weaker and weaker. And there were so many times where he was like, "No, I can feed myself." And then we, the family, would sit there and watch him struggle to pick up a fork and struggle to put some food in his mouth. And then eventually, of course, we had to feed him ourselves. And it's just like watching a man that you admire and who is very prideful, as my dad was, and as obviously Captain Kirk is, struggle to do a thing publicly is real rough. And of course, the worst person that's there to watch this is Commodore Stalker.
One of the things that's striking to me, but one of the little bits that Shatner does, bit of business, is when he reaches down to get the stylus, his eye is narrow and kind of cuts to the right. Because you see in this situation and a couple of other situations, Kirk's not vain, but Kirk is very invested in the way he comes off to other people. And he's embarrassed.
Yeah.
He's embarrassed. Now, of course, later on in the story, when we get into the hearing, he's lost it so much that he doesn't even know enough to be embarrassed when he says all the things that he says. But this is a nice little bit that Shatner does that shows that, he's embarrassed. He knows he's not at the top of his game. And of course, like Steve said, Stalker's there. Stalker's always there. And he's aware of the fact that Stalker is watching.
And he's just standing there.
Yep.
He's not saying anything. But he's just like he's just there. He's just there. And you're just like, oh my God. It's like one of those like annoying people that like, he's like a bad penny. He keeps turning up.
And again, but he approaches him with a lot of deference and says,
"I'd hope for a few words with you at your convenience."
I have very little time.
He's annoyed.
What Commodore Stalker ends up doing in this episode is terrible and stupid. But at this moment, I 100% believe that he is sincere when he says,
"Captain, I am watching 4 very valuable and 1 almost irreplaceable members of the Starfleet failing before my eyes. I want to do something to help."
And then these embarrassments are going to happen in rapid succession now, because the first thing he says, if you're worried, let's send a message to Starbase.
You sent such a message this morning.
Then he sees the yeoman and asks for the fuel consumption report.
I gave it to you, sir, and you signed it.
If I had signed it, I wouldn't ask for it, now would I?
And he looks at the report, and there's his signature.
So this moment is something I never noticed. Just like Jim, you brought up when he dropped the pen to the clipboard, and he looks to his right to see if anybody's looking at him. Okay, so I never noticed this until just the other day when I rewatched this. When Kirk goes back to sit in the captain's chair, the look on his face.
Yes, I noticed it too, yeah.
The look on Kirk's face, he knows he's losing it. Like he is in a very, very subtle in the sense that I missed it for the last 50 years, but in a very subtle way, it's finally hit him that he is losing his bearings. And when he sits back in the captain's chair and he has that look on his face, he's scared.
Well, and this is the thing about this episode that I think about now is when people get this kind of news, dementia, some degenerative disease, they have a lot of time to adjust to it. You know what I mean? Like, because they have the early signs, and it's usually a process of months, maybe years, maybe many years before they start to have real problems. This is happening in hours.
Yep. And Jim, did you notice that scene too? When that moment when Kirk sits back in the chair and he has the look on his face?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the things that you see about Kirk, I mean, Shatner does a great job in this. He doesn't approach the level that D. Kelly does as far as the physical acting, but he is very, very good at projecting the kind of paranoia that people have when they get older, particularly when they start to lose their faculties. And that just ratchets things up.
And then the next moment, because what we do is we cut to later, and Kirk is asleep in the captain's chair. And you could feel, again, this is those reaction shots, you could feel the awareness of every single person on the bridge that Kirk is asleep in the chair. And then Spock goes and wakes Kirk up.
Smart, I was just thinking.
By the way, as I've gotten older, I can completely relate to this scene where Kirk falls asleep in the chair.
Oh yeah,
I think a lot.
I think a lot too.
You should ask my wife and son. I am totally the old man that falls asleep in the chair all the time. There's my favorite books are the Patrick O'Brien novels, which are the Aubrey Maturin series. And there's a line that Stephen Maturin has that he says there are two things that a man will never admit to: being rich or being asleep.
And that brings up something too. Every time Kirk does one of these things that's embarrassing, he never apologizes. He just let's pretend it didn't happen and move on.
Yep. That's a good point. And what we find out is that we found at least the cause, which is that there was radiation. It did come from this comet. We go, okay, we're going to get that information to Dr. McCoy.
When Spock comes up to Captain Kirk and he says, I think we may have found something. The look on Kirk's face is like, oh, thank God. In his own subtle Kirk way of doing that. Like, some hope, some optimism, which at a time that we're at right now in this world,
sure,
any shred of hope and optimism, we just latch on it.
And then Kirk says, Lieutenant, let's take a message to Starfleet Command, because he wants to inform Starfleet about what's going on. And he says, due to the proximity of the Romulans, better use Code 2.
But Captain, the Romulans have broken Code 2. If you remember the last bulletin...
Then use Code 3.
And watching then Kirk try to give this message to Starfleet Command and fumbling over the quadrant and the details and the gestures that he's using to just fill that stuff in. And then it's just piled one after another, from the fuel report, from the code, the falling asleep. And now he's heading out. And just as he's leaving, he says,
"Oh, Mr. Sulu, increase orbit to 20,000 mile perigee."
You mean another 20,000, Captain?
And I've totally seen this exact thing happen of you get angry because he knows he's right. He never said that before. And so he says,
I fail to understand why each one of my commands is being questioned. Now do as you're told, Mr. Sulu.
Mr. Sulu, what is our present position?
Orbiting at 20,000, sir.
Wow, hurts. It hurts. Yeah. I don't care how many times I've seen this episode, this scene. Seeing someone that you love fall apart in front of your eyes, not being able to do the things that they did so easily and effortlessly for as long as you've known them. Basically, it's heartbreaking. It's relatable, and it's uncomfortable to watch. But it's what makes this really one of the great episodes, one of the overlooked episodes, I think.
And it becomes even more poignant when you consider how far up Kirk is. I mean, Kirk's a legend in Starfleet.
Yeah.
And to see right. He falls much higher from a much higher area than even anybody else in the story.
Yeah, that's exact. I so agree. It's because and the other thing about it too, and Jim, it's so correct, is at this point in the show, this is a family. And Kirk is the head of the family and the hero of the family. And so every time we see Uhura or Sulu or Chekov or any of them looking at this man they admire more than anybody else probably in the world is heartbreaking.
Yep.
Absolutely heartbreaking.
Radiation. Well, that's as good as answer as any, but why didn't we know about it earlier?
Possibly, Doctor, because my thinking processes are not as efficient as before.
You know, we focus on Kirk's falling apart in front of our eyes, and those are the big examples. But the same things happen to Mr. Spock internally. You know, he can feel that his brain is failing him. And what is the most important part of Spock's identity is his brain.
Absolutely. You know? His brain, his memory, his computerized brain. Yep.
Doctor, the ship's temperature is increasingly uncomfortable for me. I've adjusted the environment in my quarters to 125 degrees, which is at least tolerable.
This is one of my favorite Star Trek jokes. This is the next thing.
I see I'm not going to be making any house calls on you.
I wondered if perhaps there was something which could lower my sensitivity to cold.
I'm not a magician, Spock, just an old country doctor.
And I love Spock's response, as I always suspected. Now, here's what I love about this scene. That here, in this moment of high drama, you still have an organic display of levity. And the key word here is organic. This did not feel like a forced moment.
No.
It felt like a very natural moment.
You know, this is something that Gene Kuhn does very well.
Yep.
It's something that in its extreme form is what led to the break between him and Roddenberry. But from a storytelling perspective, the function of this sort of thing is you don't want to be grim and ratcheting things up and making them tense throughout the whole episode. You have sometimes you have to let go, and then you start it all over again. And these moments, like, you know, I'm just an old country doctor, and what I always suspected, that's the relief before they start putting the thumb screws to you again.
And we're out in the corridor, and there is Commodore Stalker, who comes to Spock.
Here comes that bad penny turning up again.
Mr. Spock, a starship can function with a chief engineer, a chief medical officer, even a first officer under physical power. But it is disastrous to have a commanding officer whose condition is any less than perfection.
I am aware of that.
So, and I want to ask, so I want to ask both of you, Stalker's next line, does he mean this? Is this sincere?
Please understand me. My admiration for Captain Kirk is unbounded. He is a great officer.
Here's my response to that. Yeah. Steve Morris, this is why you are the right person to be doing this podcast with, because I have it in my notes right in front of me that I'm holding up to the screen, which you can't see because this is a podcast, but I literally have this written down, and I'm quoting from my own notes. Stalker, what is his motivation for Spock to take command of the Enterprise? Is he really looking out for the well-being of the crew, or does he just want to get to Starbase 10 and take command of his post?
I think maybe there's a third possible interpretation. The thing that gets me about Stalker is the word that he seems to like to use more than anything else is regulations. He's got to do everything by the book. He's not a terribly imaginative guy, and Kirk kind of taps into this when he talks to Spock about him being a desk-bound paper pusher. What's really interesting about this scene, though, is that, you know, Stalker has seemed kind of milquetoast up to this point. And I do think he sincerely admires Kirk. But the discussion that he and Spock have regarding who's going to take over the ship, he kind of backs Spock into a corner and causes Spock to hang himself, which also goes to show how much Spock is degenerated. He never would have allowed himself to be boxed in verbally and logically that way otherwise.
Wow. That's a really great point. Because, so first of all, Stalker is following, and when it comes down to it, Stalker really is doing the right thing. He's seeing that the captain of the Enterprise is incapable of continuing his command. He's following rules and regulations, and he orders Spock to do something that Spock himself knows that he should be doing. holding a competency hearing on Kirk. Spock is reluctant to do it. And I'm sure we're going to get into this very much into the next act because of the relationship that Kirk and Spock have. But Spock is torn between two things, duty and loyalty, and logic and emotion. Emotion that he suppresses, but that is still there because of the relationship that he has with Kirk. I mean, that's an emotional relationship, even though if it's not an overt one. And the other thing is that it was actually Leonard Nimoy's idea to have Spock interrogate and prosecute Kirk. Dorothy Fontana had alluded to this idea early on as well, but Nimoy sent a memo to Gene Kuhn and Roddenberry suggesting the added element of having Spock follow Starfleet regulations and being pushed into doing so by Stocker. In a sense, Jim, what you just said, being forced into a corner where he had to hang himself.
Well, and this is also the beginning of Spock being crucified step by step towards the end of the episode. This is where it starts, where, Spock is held accountable for things he really doesn't want to do because of his loyalty and friendship to Kirk.
Right.
But he has no way out. He's boxed in.
Well, I think I love everything both of you have brought up. And I think this is why this isn't a showy scene here. You know what I mean? Like, there's much more dramatic stuff that's going to happen in the courtroom, in the briefing room later. But this is a scene where there's so much going on. And the first thing, just going back to Stocker, I think people can have multiple motivations at the same time. And I think that often we're not always aware of why we're doing stuff, or we think we're doing it for one reason, and actually it's more complicated. I think Stocker 100% believes that he is doing this to save these people's lives. I also think that he's a person, Kirk is a guy who's always said, give me the ball, because he wants to be in charge, and he's always scored, And Stocker has never had the ball. And he's going like, man, maybe this is the moment where I need to take the ball,
Exactly. Yep.
And because these people need to be saved. The other thing, and I think this is and I'll ask this question in a moment, but is that I think the other moment that's so key is he doesn't say, I want to take command. He says, I want you to take command.
Right. Well, that's a good point.
He's not doing this out of some man, I've always wanted to command a starship. I definitely don't think that's a motivation at all.
Right. He's not pulling a Decker.
Exactly. And the moment at which Spock says,
need I remind you, sir, that I too have contracted the same affliction.
Yes, but you're a Vulcan.
And this next line is so key. He says,
I'm half human, sir. My physical reflexes are down. My mental capacity is reduced. I tire easily. No, sir. I am not fit for command.
Well, if you are not, with your Vulcan physique, then obviously Captain Kirk cannot be.
I think that is a 100% perfectly logical argument. If Spock believes that he is not fit for command, then, and this is my question, is Kirk at this moment in the show fit for command?
The question is no, I don't think Kirk is fit for command.
I don't either.
And I think that Spock, I think he would have waited a little longer. For sure, Spock would have waited longer before he was in a situation where he said to Captain Kirk, all right, Jim, listen, enough's enough already. You can't continue as the captain of the Enterprise. He would have waited longer. Stocker sort of forced Spock into seeing the light earlier and made him do it earlier. But eventually Spock would have done that. He of course is protecting his friend, but he is also the first officer. He's the second in command of the Enterprise. So the safety of the ship and the crew is just as much his responsibility as it is Kirk. So he would have come to that conclusion on his own eventually. Stocker just made it happen sooner. But the thing is that there's one other factor that's missing here that would have probably solved a whole lot of problems moving forward. So who else on the Enterprise has commanded in very dire situations and has done? Sulu. Sulu has commanded the Enterprise twice before in times of combat, when the Gorn attacked in Arena and when the Klingons attacked in Errand of Mercy. So in two basically wartime situations, Sulu was capable enough of commanding the Enterprise, but in this situation, he's not. Now, of course, the writers just didn't think of that. But for the sake of continuity, Stalker never considers, and neither does Spock, consider to have Sulu take command.
Well, we'll come back to that in a little while because that is definitely a problem that I think we need to bring up. I also think that once Spock realizes that he's going to have to do this thing, he does accept it, but watch his walk into the turbo lift, knowing that he has to do this to his best friend.
Well, it's almost like he feels like he's going to the hangman's noose.
Yeah, exactly.
Or going to be the hangman.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that we see later with Shatner in the hearing. Pause at the door, back to us, and then go.
Yes. Yeah, good point. And again, this is this thing and this is why this is a really good episode, is it piles on. That moment would be a perfect end of Act 2. There's no, that is a dramatic moment. Oh my God, Kirk's going to have to be on trial and Spock's going to put him on trial. This is a big deal. But that isn't, because we're going to pile on one more thing, because we're back in sickbay and in comes, and we get a joke right at the beginning.
Now, this isn't going to hurt a bit.
That's what you said the last time.
Did it hurt?
Yes.
And right at that moment of levity, in comes Lieutenant Galloway, who immediately collapses and dies.
Oh, poor Galway.
Her metabolism caused her to age more rapidly than the rest of us, but the same thing's going to happen to us unless...
How long have we got, Bones?
Oh, a matter of days, perhaps hours.
And that brings us to the end of Act 2. But before we move on to Act 3, another thought occurred to me. It is a really good thing, fellas, that the landing party, whatever is infecting them, they did not bring it with them back to the Enterprise.
Right.
Like, I never thought about that. Like, in The Naked Time, one person brought back a disease and it quickly spread to the entire crew, and that was almost the end of it. In Miri, when they beamed down to the other Earth, they were not allowed to beam up because they would infect the rest of the Enterprise. And it was up to McCoy to find a cure. In the Omega Glory, there was initially a worry, a fear that whatever killed the crew of the Exeter, that Kirk and the landing party would bring it back to the Enterprise and it would kill them too. But there would be a natural immunity that would play out that would prevent that from happening. But in this situation, I wonder what this episode would have been like if this was a disease that infected the entire crew.
It would be a much rougher episode.
Yeah.
Well, it would also be a lot more expensive.
That's a good point. Well, and the thing is it would be a much weaker episode because, time is a zero-sum game. So any time we give to other characters getting old is time we take away from Kirk and our central story. It's Act 3, and we are in a trial back in the briefing room. And one of the things I love is that they restaged it. We just had a hearing in the same room in Wolf of the Fold, and the seat that you sit in, like the witness chair, is in a different place. And this is now we have Kirk put off to the side, separated very clearly. It's a beautifully staged moment. And the fact that he's slumping in his chair at the beginning of this thing, that image tells us a lot about what's going on.
The other thing that you notice is that in addition to Kirk slumping in his chair, it looks like his shirt is a little bigger on him. And the reason for that is because Bob Justman, our pal Robert H. Justman, associate producer of Star Trek at this point, he had suggested that the crew, the landing party, go through 4 distinct changes through the aging process. And he said, quote, in a memo to Gene Kuhn, all in all, I think that Bill Shatner could have a ball with this concept, and I'm certain that our regulars could also. But it was Justman who suggested that as Kirk got older, his body mass would shrink. So that is why, as Kirk got older, his shirt looked baggier and baggier.
It's a great choice.
Yeah, great choice. Really subtle, but effective.
Let it read that this competency hearing was ordered by Commodore Stalker and reluctantly called by myself.
Let it also read that I consider it invalid.
And then Stalker comes in and kind of gives his reasoning of why this is important, because we've got to get to Starbase 10.
The responsibility of this hearing is mine.
And Spock, being an honorable person, says,
On the contrary, Commodore. As presiding officer and as second in command of the Enterprise, the responsibility is mine.
Even knowing that's going to hurt his friend, he has to do what he thinks is right.
I am the captain of this ship, and I'm totally capable of commanding her. Let's call this whole thing off and get back to work.
It is quite impossible, Captain. The regulations are quite specific.
And we started going to the trial, and we call our first witness, and it's Sulu.
How long have you served with Captain Kirk?
2 years, sir.
To your knowledge, has he ever had any difficulty making decisions?
No, sir.
Did he order you to maintain orbit? Did he later on repeat that order? Did he order you to increase orbit? Yes, sir. Did he several minutes later repeat that order?
He did not.
And it's so sad.
It is sad because, yes, he did.
And everyone is looking. He says,
when I give an order, I expect it to be obeyed. I don't have to repeat myself.
And he sits down. And here's the thing that I suddenly saw. What does Kirk do throughout all of Star Trek when he is at his weakest?
What does Kirk do
when the odds are most against him? When he's going to be destroyed by the Viserys? When he is going up against odds that are completely impossible? What does he do?
He bluffs.
He bluffed in the Corbomite maneuver, but I think generally speaking, Steve, to what you're alluding to, is that he changes his strategy.
And he shows confidence. He's swagger.
Confidence and compassion. Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think he's doing the same thing here. I think deep down, he is scared and insecure, and he is putting on this whole show of having to put forth so much confidence. And what's so sad about it is this is what has worked for him forever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not here. It's not working now.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So Sulu confirms that the captain repeated his order. And again, Nimoy's, we said it a million times, but watch his acting too. It's much subtler than what McCoy and Kirk are doing, but it is really good. He brings on the yeoman who tries to say that, he had other stuff on his mind, but then she finally admits that he forgot that he signed this report, goes to Uhura and talks about the code too. And again, you watch Uhura desperately trying not to hurt her captain.
Right. And this reminds me a lot of the trial in Court Martial where, you have the yeoman and you have McCoy and Spock taking the stand. They are trying to protect their captain and their friend. So the yeoman, I don't know, for some reason, the yeoman is dismissed, but Uhura gets to stay. I don't know why, but whatever.
Because we want to have reaction shots from Uhura and we don't care about the yeoman anymore.
More time, more money.
Exactly. I love that McCoy is asleep.
Yeah. Poor bones.
And they wake him up and we hear the computer's report on what Captain Kirk's age is at this moment.
Subject's physical age, based on physiological profile, between 60 and 72, aging rapidly.
And Kirk's response.
Oh, I'm 34. I'm 34 years old.
Now, Steve, I agree with you that they should have made his age a little bit older.
A little bit,
but it's pretty cool that he's young and he's already the captain. So go with me here. So since we've been doing Enterprise incidents, I've been going on the theory that when it comes to the star dates, the first number in the star date indicates which year of the 5-year mission the Enterprise is actually on. So the star date for this episode begins with 3478.2. So that 3 at the beginning indicates that this is the 3rd year of the Enterprise 5-year mission. And Kirk just said he was 34 years old. So 2 years before that, in year 1, that means that Kirk would have been about 32 years old when he took command of the Enterprise. And at that moment is also when Sulu started to serve with him, because he just said during his testimony that he served with Captain Kirk for 2 years. So I think it's interesting, if you start to think about like the retcon in that way, that Kirk was 32 when he took command of the Enterprise.
It is interesting.
And Shepard was 2 years older at that point, though. He was 36.
Yep, that's right.
I think at this moment, and we can't know. When he says, I'm 34 years old, I think he has forgotten about the disease. I think, do you know what I mean? Like, I think he is in a moment where he's like, what are you talking about? I'm 34.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And of course I don't know, but that's how it feels to me when he says it.
Is not his mental capacity degenerating even more rapidly?
And I love McCoy's he's trying to help his friend. He says,
Yes, but he's a better man right now.
Doctor, you heard the computer's analysis of Captain Kirk's physical age. Do you agree with it?
Blasted machine, Spock. You can't argue with a machine.
He doesn't want to say it. Doesn't want to say it.
Do you agree with it, Doctor?
And McCoy looks at Kirk.
Yes, I do agree. And I am sorry, Jim.
Look at Shatner's reaction.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's saying it's okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
That is the reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, Spock's not having fun. He doesn't like doing this.
You wish to call any witnesses, Captain Kirk?
And again, this is Kirk. This is the swagger. He's trying to put it on. He laughs.
I'm perfectly capable of speaking in my own defense, Mr. Spock. There's only one reason, and one reason alone, for having this hearing. I refuse to leave Gamma Hydra IV.
And it's not even the first time he says it.
Yeah.
He's going to say it again in about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And it's Gamma Hydra IV. 4, Captain, 4.
Gamma Hydra IV, Captain.
Yes, a slip of the tongue.
Captain, your inability to remember having given commands, reading and signing important orders, and then forgetting them. Your physical analysis is compiled by your own chief surgeon.
The way Shatner plays this last bit is so good.
Mm-hmm.
All these things would appear to be irrefutable proof of failing physical and mental conditions.
So I'm a little confused. Who wouldn't be at a time like this? My ship's in trouble, my senior officers are ill, and this nonsense about a competency hearing is enough to mix up any man.
You know, we were talking a little while earlier about the scene with Jan and Kirk in the corridor where he goes, "What are you offering me, Jan, a going away present or love?" He's at the other end of the spectrum at this point. He is
yes, exactly
desperate,
yeah.
And you don't see Kirk desperate very often, but he's absolutely desperate at this point. And I think Steve's right too. I think he loses some of his self-awareness. He sometimes forgets that he's got this affliction, and he's trying to, overcome it with bluster and with that exterior image that he always projects.
In this next moment, because I think he's giving this speech and talking about, it'd mix up any man, and he's trying to present something, and then the emotions hit him.
Trying to relieve a captain of his command is, well, that's...
And then he looks at Spock.
Oh, this is horrible. This is so painful.
Spock, I wouldn't have believed it of you.
It's so painful. Just as we've gotten to this point through our analysis of the show and of these relationships, and seeing Kirk and Spock get closer and closer and closer, culminating really with the events of Amok Time, with the way that Kirk has disregarded orders to save his friend, only to have to fight him to save him again. And now here he is seeing that Spock is betraying him. Yep. It's on top of just the pain of seeing this heroic captain fall to pieces, seeing their relationship fall to pieces at the same time. It's just, I could never put my finger on it, why this episode is so much better than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But these are the reasons. These are absolutely the reasons.
And, we were talking about Nimoy's performance. You look at Nimoy, he just looks absolutely wounded.
Oh,
and there are a couple of scenes here and upcoming where he can't even meet Kirk's gaze because he's so wounded.
Yeah, that's right.
And I want to go back to this line just one more time. Trying to relieve a captain of his command. What is Kirk's true love?
His command, the Enterprise.
The Enterprise. That is what Spock is doing in his mind. And then the bluster comes back.
Go ahead, ask me questions. I'll show you what I'm capable of. There's nothing wrong with my memory. Go ahead, ask me anything.
It's so painful. It just hurts so much. And then Scott, as you brought up,
we're in orbit around Gamma Hydra IV, right?
Oh, no, 4.
And the thing is, I think he knows. He knows he messed up.
Anyhow, it doesn't matter. There's a lot more to running a starship than answering all the fool questions. A lot more.
And Spock stands up and says, no more questions.
If you would leave the room so the board can vote.
And Kirk, with lots of fake confidence, says,
good idea. Get this stupid voting over with so I can get back to running the ship.
And then he stops, just as you brought up, Jim. He stops and at the door, and he looks at Spock and then at everyone else. And then in a very different tone, he says,
I'll be in my quarters, awaiting a decision.
I think he knows 100% what's going to happen.
Oh, absolutely he does. I mean, he knows he's through. He's finished.
I got a hold of the, I think it's listed as final draft, July 27th draft of the script. And I was telling Scott yesterday that when, Kirk is trying to show how on the ball he is, he talks about, I took over command from Captain, and then Spock says Pike. Scott, you were talking about how many parts of this episode refer back to history within, the reality of the show.
Yep.
I'm sad that got cut either,
that would have been great. That was especially because in the previous episode that was filmed, we found out that the mirror universe Captain Kirk assassinated Christopher Pike.
What a guy.
What a guy.
I wonder what the thought process was for cutting it.
Since the senior officers are incapable, and I am a flag rank, I am forced by regulations to assume command.
Sir, you have never commanded a starship.
And this is the thing you brought up. He says, well, we can't have a junior officer. And this is where it's not just that. This is where Spock should have said, yes, you can. Sulu's awesome. Obviously, Spock wouldn't talk that way. But it is shocking. We're right next to the Romulans, and we're not, suggesting Sulu. We're just going to let this guy take command.
We look at this show, we watch this show, and some things, some little lapses like that, you can't explain. Some you can. I think this was one of those things where we got a deadline, we got to shoot this stuff, and we didn't think of that. But I think in Stalker's case, if you want to make excuses for it, I think in Stalker's mind, in regulations, you have senior officers and then you have junior officers. And quite frankly, the junior officers just don't have as much weight as this.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't think of Sulu.
I think that's a good explanation, but I think this next moment is so ridiculous. And of course, it takes us to where we need to be to have a great, exciting conclusion of our show.
Set a direct course for Starbase 10, Warp 5.
Across the neutral zone?
Immediately, Mr. Sulu.
Now, we've been saying this whole time that Stalker really cares about regulations, and he's doing everything because of regulation. Well, it seems to me we're pretty well established. One of the biggest laws is we should not cross the neutral zone. But he goes, yeah, let's do it. And nobody says, hold on, we can't do that.
Right, exactly. And it just goes to show you how green Stalker is. I mean, he has never commanded a starship before. Commanding a starbase, a stationary starbase, and commanding a starship are two completely different things. So the next scene takes place in Kirk's quarters. Mm-hmm. So this next scene was filmed on day 7 of the production. It took 6.5 days for them to film The Deadly Years. So this scene was filmed on the final day for the first half of the day. So then shooting on The Deadly Years wrapped right before lunch. And then after lunch, Mark Daniels came back onto the set and did a pickup scene with Barbara Luna, who was feeling better after getting very sick during the making of Mirror Mirror. And they reshot, they didn't reshoot it. They shot the scene where Marlena Moreau was in that sexy outfit and she has her big kiss with Kirk. So try to imagine you're William Shatner and you're in old makeup and you're, your mind is in one episode, and then you have lunch, and for the rest of the day you go back to filming in that sleeveless top, and you're back in the mirror universe in your quarters making out with Barbara Luna.
That's one thing that I had never known until reading more recently in the last couple of years, is how many times they would split a day to either do pickups for the previous episode or get started on the next one. And I'm with you, Scott. It's like, as an actor, how do you shift gears like that?
Amazing. It's another reason why acting is so overlooked for its difficulty, that you have to, they're shooting out of order, and you're like putting your head like, okay, where am I in this scene? And it's not as easy as like you're filming chronologically. That hardly ever happens in film or TV, but it's a testament to their just how talented they were, or at least in this case, how talented Shatner was, that he could, shift gears from the Deadly Years back to Mirror Mirror, and then come back the next day and continue on with the Deadly Years.
What I always compare the job of an actor to is it's like baseball, in the sense that a lot of people say that the hardest thing anyone can do in sports is to hit a baseball. And that is that if you're doing it 1 out of, 15 times, and you get in and you have a 200 average or 250 average, you're pretty good.
Yeah.
Is that what happens in baseball is you don't do that much all the time. And then there's this one moment, everybody's looking at you, and you have to perform in front of all these people and succeed. And that is, you're sitting around, you're in your trailer half the day, and then you get called onto the set and everybody's staring on you, and you have to act as if you've suddenly aged 50 years and you can't remember, and you're having these huge emotional moments. Then you have to wait around, and then you have to make out with somebody. And, it's super high difficulty at a very small amount of time.
Absolutely.
And Spock and Dr. Wallace come in. I have no idea why Dr. Wallace is in this, comes in, except that it's important for the scene later.
Oh, I've been relieved.
I'm sorry, Captain.
Yes. You should have been a prosecuting attorney.
And Spock tries to explain himself, and Kirk is having none of it.
None of it.
Regulations require...
Regulations? Don't give me regulations. You want command all along.
And then this moment of...
Captain, I have not assumed command.
You're proud of the... I mean, you've not assumed command.
And he explains that he's sick too, and Commodore Stalker is in command.
Stalker? Are you crazy? He's never had a field command.
Mr. Scott was unfit for command. Commodore Stalker is ranking officer.
Don't talk to me about rank. Man's a chair-bound paper pusher.
So here's what's interesting. He refers to Stalker as a chair-bound paper pusher.
Oh, I know where you're going.
Where am I going with this, Steve Morris?
His motion picture, is that where that thing is, where he's an admiral?
Yep. That's exactly where I'm going. Becoming a chair-bound paper pusher is what would happen to Captain James T. Kirk at the end of this 5-year mission, when he was promoted to admiral, at least until V'ger reared its ugly head and he got to, basically pulled a dick move to take the Enterprise back.
Yeah, basically. And this moment, it's so sad. It's sad for all the things that both of you have said. We've built up their relationship. These are best friends in the world. And Kirk says,
"You traitorous, disloyal. You stabbed me in the back the first chance you get. Spock."
And the look on Spock's face, the pain that you see in Spock's face.
Get out. I never want to have to look at you again.
Another testament to just how brilliant Nimoy really was with playing Spock.
Spock really has a hard time in this episode. Which is the next one that shoots after Deadly?
I Mud.
Okay, so I'm surprised that in I Mud, Spock will even talk to Kirk.
Well, one of the things, that we talked about, that the mental decline is faster than the physical decline. You know what they don't say, but I feel is really true, is the emotional decline. Mm-hmm. Is that Kirk is losing emotional control as well, and lashing out with all of this anger at this moment. And Spock leaves sheepishly, leaving Dr. Wallace and Kirk alone. And he didn't know she was there. You could see in his performance, he turns around and sees her, and then has to kind of pull himself together,
He has to stand up straight because he's in front of this. I think partially it's because it's just a woman, how Kirk is.
Yeah.
But especially, this is somebody who she's not used to seeing Kirk all bent over and diminished, and he's trying to pull it together.
I made a fool of myself. Shouldn't have let him confuse me, rattle me.
I really do think he knew, he put out a lot of bluster, but he knew what was going on. And her line is so interesting. And I think this is a real thing. This is a real thing. She says,
Everybody understood.
and it's like, having dealt with people with diseases. Yeah, I know they understand. That doesn't make it easy. In fact, sometimes people being really understanding makes it harder.
Yep.
But I'm not old, Jan. I'm not. A few muscular aches doesn't make a man old, and you don't run a starship with your arms, you run it with your head.
And see, this is where it comes 180 degrees. He's exactly opposite of where he was.
Yeah.
How self-aware he was I think it was Act 1 in the corridor with Jan. And this has one of my favorite funny intentional or unintentional line reading.
I admit I'm getting a little gray, but radiation will do that thing.
Yeah, he's definitely trying to downplay. But by the way, it is in this scene that we see the cover shot that is used on photo novel number 11. Just saying.
All right. And then he said, and this is the thing, I think he really, it's hard to see yourself sometimes. Like, I mean, not, it's just what you said, Jim. He's lost that self-awareness.
Oh, Jim, will you forgive me? I have
Jan,
some work to do.
You know me. Look at me closely. Tell me. Am I getting old?
But in the scene in the corridor in Act 2, Kirk says, he goes, and old.
Yeah.
In Act 2, he was sort of facing it with grace.
Yeah.
And now he's facing it with so much more vulnerability.
He's losing everything that makes him, the captain that he is. I mean, back in The Enemy Within, they talk about how the good Kirk and bad Kirk are separated and you can't be an effective captain without both halves. In this case, he's right. You can't, you run a starship with your intellect, but his intellect is going.
We keep talking about losing what he loves the most. He's losing the Enterprise. But as we saw in This Side of Paradise, what is it that makes the Enterprise the Enterprise? And the answer to that is the crew. Because without the crew, the Enterprise is an empty shell. The soul of the Enterprise is its crew. And part of that soul, what gives Kirk sustenance, is the crew of the Enterprise. And that is what he is losing.
We're in sickbay, and now Kirk's hair is all white. And he sees Spock and says, nastily,
what are you doing here?
It would seem to be the place where I can be of the most use.
Maybe you'd like to relieve Dr. McCoy.
Wow. Ouch.
Nasty, vicious Kirk is not a really nice guy.
No, he's not.
And again, we go back to Chekov. That's the big question. And what I love about this scene is that despite the fact that Kirk is furious at Spock, is that we see that Kirk, Spock, and McCoy together are one great brain because they work this out together.
Beamed down together. We were on the surface together in the same spot. We were together all the time.
No, not all the time, Captain. He left us for a few moments.
He left us? He left us.
And then Kirk's wheels are turning.
He went into the building. Spock. Something happened.
And I love Nimoy, man.
Yes. Yes, indeed, Captain. Doctor, you'll remember.
And then Kirk has it.
He was scared. He saw the dead body. And he ran out of the building, and he was scared to death.
What I love about this scene is how many times have we seen the big three together, each taking different points as they volley, as each one of they pass the ball to the other person as they're figuring out a situation. Or even when it's just Kirk and Spock, like in the briefing room scene in The Alternative Factor. But here they are, the three of them, way in the advanced stages of this affliction. And they are feeding off of each other. They are gaining strength for this brief moment. It's like they're back.
It's almost like that's all they have left.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's great too is they basically, Spock and Kirk set it up for McCoy to take it home.
Right, scared. Heart beats faster. Breath gets short, and there's cold sweats.
Adrenaline froze. Adrenal activity.
Adrenaline activity. Bingo.
It was ancient history just after the atomic age, used for radiation sickness. Adrenaline.
Now, I ran out of time, but I was trying to look to see if this actually was true, if adrenaline, and I couldn't find out. So if someone out there...
I think so, but certainly not like this.
Right.
Not like this.
And Dr. Wallace is like, no, we got some great medicine for radiation sickness. And he's like, yeah.
Yes. Now, before that adrenaline.
And now Spock is like, yeah, I think we could put something together. And McCoy goes,
well, don't just stand that jaw and Spock. You and Dr. Wallace get cracking.
McCoy is so great. DeForest Kelley is so terrific in this scene. He's awesome.
Entering Romulan neutral zone, sir.
It's like, what are you doing, dude?
Yeah.
Lieutenant Uhura, let me know if we contact any Romulan.
And right on cue.
I think we just made contact, sir.
Dripping with sarcasm.
They're bracketed, sir.
Engineering wants instructions, sir.
Commodore Stoker, what are your orders?
And he is frozen. He is a deer in the headlights. And that is the end of Act 3.
Act 4, the Enterprise is taking a beating. We're in sickbay, and Kirk wants to get to the bridge. He is trying to get to the bridge, and they will not let him go.
So in the footage in the original version of this episode, the Romulan attack was compiled from two different episodes. One of them, of course, being Balance of Terror, because that's where we see the Romulan ships firing and, decloaking and everything. And the shots of the Enterprise actually taking the hit from the Romulans came from Errand of Mercy, where the Enterprise was really taking the hits from the Klingons from a ship that we didn't see. So here is where, when I was watching The Deadly Years, back, I think it was in 2006 or 2007, with the remastered, redone visual effects, that was such a big surprise, because like when I watched The Doomsday Machine or Balance of Terror with the redone special effects, I was expecting that. But what I wasn't expecting from The Deadly Years was that they were going to redo the visual effects for the Romulan attack on the Enterprise. And that scene in the new visual effects that were done by Dave Rossi and Mike and Denise Okuda, I think that stuff came out terrific.
It's cool, yeah.
It's really, really cool. And I think that this is another episode that is improved by the new visual effects.
And you know that it was probably Mike who was really bothered by the fact that those were photon torpedoes and not Romulan weapons.
Absolutely, sure, yes.
And on the bridge, Stalker's just like, can we just talk to the Romulans?
If I could talk to them, explain to them why we violated the neutral zone.
The Romulans are notorious for not listening to explanations.
And I love Sulu's line. And this, again, to your point, Scott, about continuity.
Lieutenant Uhura is right, sir. We tangled with them before.
I love that line. Another great throwback to Balance of Terror, and another great way that this episode, in many ways, establishes good continuity.
Greenhorn, up there running my ship.
Jim, if I have to give you a shot.
No.
Jim, boy, you just lay quiet. You can't do no good. We're both through.
No, my ship.
All right, I want to stop you right there. Kirk is desperate to get to the bridge.
Yes.
He tried to get to the bridge when before, and they had to tie him down, and he keeps repeating, "My ship," and then he says again with a stronger inflection, "My ship," and I think at that moment he is actually remembering the moment in the briefing room when he got the disease, and he thought to himself, "Never lose you."
Yeah.
Never. Absolutely an unofficial way to establish continuity, but I think there is definitely a connection between what Kirk was feeling at that moment and the way he felt in the briefing room after he got the disease in the Naked Time.
A, I totally agree. And B, at this moment, I actually think this 80-something-year-old Kirk, 100-year-old Kirk, is still a better commander than Commodore Stalker.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that I wish that he could go up. I also, by the way, so we've seen the Enterprise shake all sorts of times. We've seen big shakes and constant shakes and different kind of shakes. I think Spock's slight stumble as he walks in with the medicine is so good.
Doctor, make the necessary computations and produce this serum. It is crude and dangerous. It could cure or kill, Doctor.
Don't give me any Vulcan details, Spock. Just give me the shot.
No. I'll take the first shot.
That's our guy.
Yep.
He says no.
Yeah, and it's not even he's doing it because, oh, this is a way I can get up on the bridge. He's very, after having been so foggy, he's very clear, and he says it. He goes,
How long do you think the ship can take the pounding? I've got to get up there.
Jim, it could kill you.
I'll die anyway.
If there's a chance, then he knows he's the guy who can get them out of it. So he's got to get it first.
It's a great moment.
It's literally exactly what I wrote in my notes. And that the moment he says, I'll die anyway, that's full Kirk. I think that moment is actually the heroic Captain Kirk moment, not the one that happens on the bridge, which is awesome. And I totally love it. The I'll die anyway, that's Kirk.
But that's another reason why this episode feels so relevant and relatable. Because how many times have we had people, loved ones, Steve, you mentioned yourself, whether it's dementia or Alzheimer's, where for a moment they're back and they're fine.
Yeah.
And that's where Kirk is with this.
Yep. It's funny. You know what got him there? Probably adrenaline. Before he's going to get the adrenaline.
That's
right. They give him the shot and he immediately collapses and then is screaming.
Well, what's happening?
The aging process has stopped. His bodily functions are getting stronger.
Okay. So I was talking about the bloopers before.
Okay.
So there was a great blooper. And I don't know if this was a blooper or this was just a deleted scene. But there's this great shot of DeForest Kelly, covered with all the makeup, where it's like, what's happening?
What's going on?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And back on the bridge, Stalker basically goes, opinion, Mr. Sulu. And I'm going like, my opinion is Mr. Sulu should have been in command.
They know they have us. They know our shields will give out.
Well, then we have no alternative but to surrender.
Sir, the Romulans do not take captives.
His delivery is great. For the guy who was the comic relief through this entire show, the venomous anger he has in this moment is fantastic.
We're losing power, sir.
What am I going to do? I've got to do something.
And then, at that moment, the doors open. Right there, coming out of the turbo lift, Captain James T. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise.
Report, Mr. Sulu.
He's fit and trim and looks like he did at the beginning of this episode. His hair is perfectly in place. And this is the moment where, when I think back to Star Trek and the great Kirk moments, like, this is why I would follow James T. Kirk into an active volcano. And I've said this many times, Steve, as you know. This is another one of those moments. He just seizes control. This is the Kirk that we love. The Kirk with the bravado, the swagger, the confidence, cool as a cucumber. This is why Kirk is great, and this is why Shatner was born to play him.
And here's the thing, is that we've talked throughout this whole episode about how important these reaction shots were in watching the crew watching Kirk's decline and how painful it was for each one of them. And that isn't just for those moments. That is something that we earned to pay off now, because the moment that he walks in and it goes around the bridge and we see all of them see Kirk, and all of them, despite the fact that they're real close to everybody dying, all go, it's going to be okay. He's back.
Yeah. He's back. Yeah. They're all smiling. They're all relieved. This is our captain.
I agree. I mean, and it kind of reminds me in the first motion picture, Scott, Kirk takes over command, and Uhura says, "Well, our chances of coming back from this may have just doubled."
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that was a deleted scene for the motion picture.
Yeah,
they didn't play, they didn't show that scene until it aired on the ABC Sunday Night Movie.
We're surrounded by Romulan vessels, maximum of 10. Range 50 to 100,000 kilometers.
Engineering, this is the captain. I want full emergency power. I want the warp drive engines on full standby. Kirk out.
And then he does another throwback, Steve. What is that throwback?
Scott, I'm so glad you asked me that question because, of course, this is one of the great references ever because we're going to go back to the Corbomite maneuver. And it's a fantastic plant and payoff, too, because after he gets everything set up and he goes to Uhura and he says,
open up a special channel to Starfleet Command. Code 2.
And there's this moment where Uhura reacts is like, oh, no, he's not back.
But Captain, Code...
That's an order, Lieutenant. Code 2.
That's such a great moment. Kirk knows exactly what he is doing. The Romulans have broken Code 2, and he wants the Romulans to hear everything he is about to say.
From Enterprise to Starfleet Command this sector. Have inadvertently encroached upon Romulan neutral zone, surrounded and under heavy Romulan attack. Escape impossible, shields failing. Will implement the struct order using Corbomite device recently installed.
Spock, by the way, still an old man, has a great reaction and a nod like, okay, I know what this guy's going to do.
Since this will result in the destruction of the Enterprise and all matter within a 200,000 kilometer diameter and establish a corresponding dead zone, all Federation ships will avoid this area for the next 4 solar years. Explosion will take place in 1 minute.
It's great.
It's great. It's just such a nick of time kind of thing because, Steve, when we were talking about Mirror Mirror, and it was a race against time to get back to the Prime Universe. And then suddenly they had 3 hours left. And then suddenly they actually had only a half hour.
Right.
Plus, Spock has orders to kill Captain Kirk if he doesn't destroy the Halkins. So just that happens in this episode. So they're dying. The landing party, except for Chekov, is dying. And as if that wasn't bad enough, now they're in the neutral zone in Romulan territory under attack from 10 Romulan birds of prey. And the whole crew's going to die. The Enterprise is going to be completely destroyed. And Kirk just is one of the ultimate Captain Kirk saves the day moments. And he does it effortlessly with confidence and bravado. And it's like, this is why Kirk is he's just the best captain in all of Star Trek.
It's kind of interesting, too, that, Scott, you'll know this, that Roddenberry said we should have some kind of references to what the Corbomite maneuver is. And Gene Kuhn said no, because Gene Kuhn understood the intelligence of the audience.
Yep. Mm-hmm, and
right. Understood that would get into exposition that would totally screw the rhythm of the scene.
I couldn't agree more, and that's exactly what I was going to ask. Is I wonder, okay, it's 1967 and this comes on TV. I mean, we've watched these episodes over and over again. So the second we hear Corbomite, we're like, we know what's going on. Yeah. But you might have missed that. I wonder how many people watching went, "Oh my God, that's like one of those early episodes. I totally remember that."
Yeah, I wonder how many did or didn't.
Even if they didn't, it doesn't even matter because again, everybody on the bridge, their reaction, Spock, for instance, they're letting you in on the gag,
Romulans giving ground, Captain. Obviously, they tapped in as you expected them to.
A logical assumption, Mr. Spock. Are they still retreating?
Yes, sir.
Good. Warp factor 8, now.
And they go off, and the Romulans fall behind. They were totally caught off guard. We're out of the neutral zone, secure from red alert. This is the fastest resolution to any big battle we've ever had.
For sure.
And Stalker, kind of embarrassed himself, says,
"Captain, I just wanted to assure you that I did what I thought best to save both you and the men."
And I believe him.
Yeah.
I think he did. I think he obviously horribly wrong, but to go into the neutral zone, other than going into the neutral zone, I think he made good decisions.
I was going to say one thing that we were talking about the fact that he's what was it, Scott?
Desk-bound paper pusher.
Paper pusher, yeah. It's interesting. You look at his uniform. He's not wearing a command uniform.
Right. He's wearing a Commodore uniform.
Services. So he's completely out of his depth. I mean, I think, Steve, I think you're exactly right. I think he's absolutely sincere, but he never had the toolbox to pull this off.
For sure. Definitely was not playing with a full deck of cards.
You should know, however, that there's very little a starbase can do that a starship can't.
But I love his response. I love Stocker's response.
Shows a lot of class.
If I may say so, Captain, I am now quite aware of what a starship can do. With the right man at the helm.
In comes McCoy, looking young and spry.
Anytime you're ready, Mr. Spock.
I am quite ready now, Doctor.
Because of your Vulcan physique, I've prepared an extremely potent shot for you. However, I thought you might like to know that I've removed all the breakables from sickbay.
That is very considerate of you, Doctor.
Oh, poor Spock.
I think that's fun. I don't know. I think that's a funny little bit.
Well, gentlemen, all in all, an experience we'll remember in our old age.
And then he feels his back.
Which won't be for some while, I hope.
Then finally, take over, Mr. Sulu. Why didn't we have you take over a long time ago?
Oh my gosh, you're so right.
Steady as she goes.
Steady as she goes, Captain.
I thought I said that.
And that is the end of the episode.
So here's what's interesting. So up until this episode went before the cameras, there was a scene that was going to be filmed that was in that final draft that was not filmed because they ran behind schedule. And oh, what a scene that would have been, and what a great entertaining moment that would have provided. So after Kirk takes the shot in the filmed version of the episode that we saw, you see Kirk writhing, sees his lower body writhing in pain in the bed. Well, the scene that was written, so after Kirk takes the shot, he makes his own way to the bridge. And as he is going from level to level, you see him get younger and younger.
Wow.
Until he steps out of the turbo lift onto the bridge, and he looks like the Kirk that we know. And the problem is that the way they timed out the episode, everything was supposed to be, right on schedule. But Joseph Pevney could not understand why they were falling behind. And Steve and Jim, what do people do when they get older? They talk more slowly.
Oh, that's a good point. Interesting.
So even something like that, talking more slowly, apparently slowed production down enough where when it came down to it, they would have pushed this episode into another half day over schedule, and they had to move on. So that's why they just shot what they shot, and it still works. It's still a great moment, because when you actually do see Kirk walk off the bridge, younger, sprightly, bouncing back onto the bridge, it actually is a really awesome payoff.
Two things. One is what surprised me, what I assumed made it go slower is all the makeup. Makeup will slow you way, way down.
Sure.
And I think it's a great thing that they didn't do that because, as you said, Scott, I would have robbed us of the moment of seeing young Kirk for the first time.
Sure.
That's what makes that moment so great. Did people have anything to say about this episode?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, they did. So Joseph Pevney said, interestingly, the biggest problems with filming The Deadly Years were the egos of the actors. As I remember, very difficult. DeForest Kelley was very upset because he had the feeling that this episode was his, that he was the chief character of the show, and I was spending more time with Bill than I was spending with him. Very interesting. So Sarah Marshall, who played Janet Wallace, she said the stories were just fantastic. It's like we take them for granted now. They were fabulous stories. I thought The Deadly Years was very well written, and it was a joy to finally see it. Beverly Washburn, who played Galway, said, it was a fun role, and I got along with everybody. And William Shatner was quite the cut-up. I remember DeForest Kelley was very soft-spoken and warm, and Leonard Nimoy was nice, but quiet and more serious. Not as much of a character as Shatner. And Jim, you touched on this earlier, but DeForest Kelley said, there was a great disturbance in the force. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Wrong, I'm crossing the streams. DeForest Kelley said, there was a great disturbance at the studio at the time because they felt that I should have been nominated for that show, but I was not. They were very upset about it.
I wonder, I'm a big Bill Shatner fan, big Kirk fan, but I kind of wonder if the reason that they didn't push D. Kelly was Nimoy had been nominated twice and Shatner hadn't been nominated at all. And maybe somebody thought, well, that's really, because at that point he was counting lines.
Well, right. Well, by this point in the production, Jim, there was only one season for which Star Trek was nominated, and that was, the first time that Nimoy was nominated. So, between the fact that Nimoy was nominated and Shatner wasn't, and the fact that Spock was becoming quite the popular character by this point, even overshadowing Kirk. And yes, I mean, even Norman Spinrad mentioned during our discussion on Doomsday Machine that he saw that Shatner was counting lines. So there was definitely some tension in that area. And I'm a big Shatner fan like you are, but it wouldn't surprise me either.
Yeah, it's too bad. And it was to me, it was kind of surprising that there was so much rancor from D. Kelly, because D. Kelly was always the guy in the cast that everybody liked. He was always laid back. So yeah, that's interesting, that dynamic behind the scenes.
Well, what I want to know is, Steve Morris, after this deep conversation on the Deadly Years, how has your assessment of this episode changed?
I always liked it, and I like it even more now. And part of it is it's where I am in my own life and experiences I had that I hadn't had when I was a kid. And part of it is just observing much more closely everything these characters are going through. And it's funny, there's something that that we talked about, I don't remember in which episode, but I think it was in one of the episodes that was less successful, is that what we were talking about was that there was a bunch of ingredients for Star Trek. Good ideas that we were exploring, adventure, but one of them that had been missing was deep emotional connection to something personal for the characters. And that is where this episode truly shines.
Agreed.
This isn't a huge adventure. It does have some science fiction ideas, but what it's really exploring is it allows us to look at these other sides of the characters. And for me, at least, the big revelation was the deep vulnerability and even insecurity of Captain James T. Kirk. And we've seen him in pretty weak positions, including Enemy Within, including Dagger of the Mind, a whole bunch of times where he's, in real bad, weak positions. But I don't think I've ever seen him as vulnerable consistently. And it's real painful and real difficult. And so I had a very strong, visceral, emotional reaction to watching it this time. And I think what's interesting is we talked about the great episodes of Star Trek, and obviously that's part of what makes it great. But I think these second tier episodes of Star Trek, that's maybe even more impressive in some ways, that even the lesser ones, there's powerful stuff to find. Agreed. As I did in this episode.
I completely agree. I mean, Steve, I think that the revelations continually when we cover some of these like second tier episodes, and a second tier Star Trek episode is a great Star Trek episode by any other name. Jim, how do you feel about the Deadly Years after this conversation?
For me, the shorthand take on Star Trek, people who don't watch the show, the focus seems to be on the thematic stuff, on the allegorical level. But my own personal feeling has always been it's about the characters. And I think that the proof of the pudding is you go forward, 15 years or so, and Nick Meyer picks up the Gene Kuhn mantle.
For sure.
And he doesn't focus on, at least until The Undiscovered Country, he doesn't really focus on the allegory. He focuses on the characters.
Yeah. Right.
On the characters. And this is an episode where you really get all the mileage out of it that you can. It's something that you see things in this episode that you would never see in The Next Generation, where everybody gets along and everybody's cool and all that stuff. They were not afraid to put these characters head to head.
Yep.
And when you do that, you reveal more of the characters, you make them more vivid and bring them to life better, And when you got a cast as good as this one, who can actually carry that load from the script.
I agree. And I agree with so much of everything that you said, Steve, about your assessment, especially when it comes to to finding this episode more relatable now than you ever did because of just life and circumstance. And also exactly what you said about character, about the dynamic with these characters and how we've seen them get closer and closer through very, very trying circumstances that made them so solid, whether it's The Enemy Within or Amok Time. But for me, one of the things that really jumped out at me this time was just how it established how lived in the Star Trek universe was, even by this very early point, how lived in the Enterprise felt. There was a history there. There's continuity. Some of it is overt, like referring to the Corbomite device, referring to the Romulans. We tackled them before. But even some of the themes that are more subtle, like Kirk maybe thinking back to that moment in The Naked Time, the romantic interest referring to 6 years, 4 months, and an odd number of days, stuff like that. There's so much that is like where Star Trek feels so lived in, and even an episode that, while the story itself may not be like a City on the Edge of Forever or a Mirror Mirror or a Balance of Terror, it is so exceptionally well done. All the little details, like with the shirt being a little bit bigger, some of the mannerisms, some of the glances that Shatner would make, I was able to appreciate that so much more this time around. And I know I've said this before many times, Steve, but this is definitely another episode that I already loved, and it has gone way up in my assessment of this series.
So that's what we think of the Deadly Years, but we want to hear your thoughts, and the best place to give them to us is on social media. Maybe you could visit our Facebook page, just do a search for Enterprise Incidents. But if you're a Twitter kind of person, then look for Enter Incidents. On Instagram, it's Enterprise Incidents. And we would love you to subscribe to the show at wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube. Hey, you know what? Subscribe to all of them. Why not? And while you're on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. They're very, very important. We're so thrilled. We just passed 200 5-star reviews. That's a huge step for us. And the next step, I think, is 2,000. I think that should be the next one we get to. And we need all of you to contribute to do that. Leave your comments on YouTube. And if you want to reach me, you can do it at SR Morris on Twitter, SR Morris1 on Instagram. And if you're interested in other movies that deal with growing older, well, maybe you might want to check out the Cinephiles episodes on No Country for Old Men, where Tommy Lee Jones is dealing with his own mortality. You can watch Rock Hudson age through a whole lifetime in Giant, an elderly gunslinger in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. You can see a whole lifetime of a very complicated story in There Will Be Blood. And of course, one of the greatest performances of any actor going through every stage of life in history is, of course, Orson Welles in Citizen Kane.
You forgot one, Steve.
I did?
Yes. If you want to talk about dealing with getting older, you got a movie hiding in plain sight there on the Cinephiles covering Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
You know what's funny? I almost mentioned it, and then I was like, we mentioned it a bunch. We put it on the feed. I'll just skip it, but you're absolutely right. So that's how you would find me and my work. Scott, how would people find you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Mance. And like Steve said, please be sure you not only subscribe to Enterprise Incidents, but make sure you give us a review. And more important than anything, if you are listening to Enterprise Incidents, we are so grateful for the reviews you've already given. Please feel free to write another one for us if you haven't already done that. But definitely, for sure, be sure to share Enterprise Incidents on your social media so more people find us. And here, we're hearing all the time from people who are listening and saying, "Oh, I just discovered this podcast." Please help more people discover Enterprise Incidents by sharing Enterprise Incidents on your own social media platform. Jim Brooks, I am so excited and we are so excited to have you join us on Enterprise Incidents. Thank you so, so very, very much. Are you on social media? Where can people check you out?
I'm not on social media. But yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking me. Like I said, I've listened to a lot of the other episodes, and it's a good show. And it's also good that, as both of you were saying, this is an excellent way for people to rediscover the original series, which I think sometimes gets forgotten in the wake of the new show's discovery and all that stuff. It really was a great show. It was a great show, and I appreciate you guys bringing me on, letting me participate. Thanks.
Well, it's been great having you, Jim. Thank you so much for coming on. So much enjoyed this conversation. But Scott, I'm curious about where the Starship Enterprise is going next week.
The next voyage of the Starship Enterprise brings a lot of levity to the Enterprise, in addition to the return of a fan favorite. We are going to see once again on Star Trek the return of Harcourt. That's right. Harcourt, Fenton Mudd, and I Mudd. I Mudd is the next episode we are covering on Enterprise Incidents. That is going to be a doozy of a conversation for sure. I cannot wait to have this one with Steve Morris. Until the next episode of Enterprise Incidents on I Mudd, keep going boldly.